The United States just escalated its rhetoric toward Iran in a way that few analysts expected this quickly. But Tehran's response has done something even more consequential. It rejected the ceasefire proposal outright again, and in doing so may have just shifted the strategic balance across the Middle East. Within the last hour, former President Donald Trump issued a sharply worded response, condemning Iran's refusal to accept a proposed de-escalation framework tied to the ongoing regional confrontation. The message was blunt, the tone unmistakably confrontational. But here's the twist that most mainstream coverage is missing. Iran's rejection isn't simply defiance. It reflects a calculated strategic posture involving Russia, regional militias, and energy leverage that could ripple through global markets and security alliances in the coming weeks. And the implications go far beyond Washington and Tehran. Oil markets are already reacting. Gulf states are quietly repositioning their security posture. And European diplomats are scrambling behind closed doors. So what exactly is happening here, and why did Tehran reject a ceasefire that many believed was already negotiated? Hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to explain shows exactly how this confrontation could reshape the geopolitical balance of the Middle East. Now let me give you the background here, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. The tensions currently unfolding between Washington and Tehran are the product of more than 4 decades of strategic rivalry, but the immediate trajectory toward this moment accelerated over the last 18 months. Specifically after October 2024, when a series of proxy confrontations intensified across the Middle East, stretching from southern Lebanon to the Red Sea shipping lanes. According to data released by the U.S. Central Command in January 2026, Iranian-backed militia groups conducted more than 140 separate drone and rocket attacks against U.S. military installations in Iraq and Syria between March 2024 and December 2025. These groups, primarily Kataib Hezbollah, Harakat al-Nujaba, and the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, operate with varying degrees of autonomy, but intelligence assessments from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency consistently conclude that their operational capacity depends heavily on Iranian financing, training, and weapons transfers. At the same time, Iran's broader regional strategy has been evolving. Tehran is no longer relying solely on direct confrontation. Instead, it has constructed what security analysts refer to as a distributed deterrence network. This network stretches across Lebanon through Hezbollah, Syria through the IRGC Quds Force, Iraq through Shia militias, and Yemen through the Houthis. The objective is straightforward: create multiple pressure points that can complicate American or Israeli military responses. Now consider the diplomatic layer. In December 2025, a quiet series of negotiations began in Muscat, Oman, facilitated by Omani Foreign Minister Saeed Badr al-Busaidi. The proposal under discussion involved a limited ceasefire arrangement designed to reduce proxy attacks in exchange for partial sanctions, relief tied to humanitarian banking channels. European Union representatives, particularly EU High Representative Josep Borrell, were reportedly involved in drafting the preliminary framework. For weeks, the assumption among Western diplomats was that Tehran might accept the deal. Oil exports from Iran had already climbed to approximately 1.6 million barrels per day, according to tanker tracking data compiled by Kpler Analytics in February 2026, and a ceasefire arrangement could have stabilized that revenue stream while easing pressure on the Iranian currency, the rial. That was the conventional wisdom. In Washington policy circles, the expectation was that Iran, facing inflation exceeding 38% domestically, according to figures from the Statistical Center of Iran, published in November 2025, would prioritize economic stability over escalation. But here's where the calculation went wrong. Iran's leadership, particularly Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps command structure, appears to have reached a different strategic conclusion entirely. Instead of viewing the ceasefire proposal as an opportunity, they appear to see it as leverage. And that brings us to the moment that triggered the current crisis. Because what happened next, Tehran's formal rejection of the ceasefire and Donald Trump's immediate response, has set off a chain reaction across diplomatic, military, and energy markets. Now let's turn to the moment that triggered the current crisis. On March 11, 2026, Iranian officials formally communicated through Omani mediators that Tehran would not accept the proposed ceasefire framework that had been circulating quietly among Western and Gulf diplomats for nearly 3 weeks. According to diplomatic cables referenced by Reuters and Al Monitor, the message was delivered during a closed-door meeting in Muscat at approximately 0940 local time, where Iranian negotiators reportedly stated that the conditions failed to address the structural causes of regional instability. That phrasing is important, because publicly Iran framed the rejection as a principled objection to sanctions pressure, but privately multiple diplomats familiar with the discussions describe a much more calculated position. Tehran's negotiators reportedly insisted on 3 additional provisions before any de-escalation could occur. First, a binding commitment that the United States would halt military support for Israeli operations targeting Iranian assets in Syria. Second, expanded sanctions relief beyond humanitarian banking channels, specifically allowing access to frozen oil revenues held in South Korean and Japanese accounts, totaling approximately $6.7 billion, according to Treasury Department estimates. And third, perhaps most significant, a regional security guarantee that would limit U.S. naval operations in the Persian Gulf during the ceasefire period. For Washington, those demands were non-starters. Within hours of Tehran's rejection, former President Donald Trump issued a statement on his Truth Social platform at 14:12 Eastern Time, sharply criticizing Iran's position. The statement read, in part, "Iran is once again refusing peace while threatening the entire Middle East. Weak leadership allowed this situation to escalate, and it shows exactly why strength is necessary when dealing with regimes like this." The language immediately reverberated through diplomatic circles, not simply because of the tone, but because Trump's remarks signaled a potential return to the maximum pressure doctrine that defined U.S. policy toward Iran between 2018 and 2020, when Washington withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the JCPOA, and imposed sweeping sanctions targeting Iranian oil exports, banking systems, and shipping networks. Markets reacted almost instantly. By 15:30 GMT, Brent crude futures jumped from $86.40 to $89.75 per barrel, according to trading data from the Intercontinental Exchange in London. The movement wasn't catastrophic, but it reflected something deeper. Investors suddenly pricing in the possibility that tensions could spill into the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow maritime corridor through which approximately 21% of global oil supply passes every day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's 2025 Maritime Energy Report. Meanwhile, the diplomatic response unfolded rapidly. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, representatives from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom convened an emergency consultation session late Tuesday evening. A joint communiqué released shortly afterward urged all parties to exercise restraint and maintain channels of dialogue. But behind the scenes, European officials were reportedly frustrated. According to senior diplomats speaking anonymously to Politico Europe, negotiators believed Tehran had been within inches of agreement before abruptly shifting its position. One official described the reversal as a strategic pivot rather than a negotiation failure. And the evidence supporting that assessment is growing. Within hours of rejecting the ceasefire, Iranian state media outlets, particularly Tasnim news agency, which is closely aligned with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, began publishing commentary emphasizing Iran's readiness to expand its axis of resistance. That phrase is not rhetorical flourish. It refers to a coordinated network of allied organizations spanning multiple countries. Consider what happened next. In southern Lebanon, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah delivered a televised address late Tuesday evening, declaring that regional resistance forces were prepared for prolonged confrontation if necessary. At nearly the same moment, reports emerged from Baghdad indicating that the militia coalition known as the Islamic Resistance in Iraq had increased its operational readiness around U.S. installations near Ain al-Assad Air Base in Anbar province. And in the Red Sea, maritime monitoring platforms such as marine traffic detected increased activity from vessels associated with Yemen's Houthi movement, which has previously targeted commercial shipping lanes using anti-ship missiles and drones. 3 theaters, 3 signals, 1 coordinated message. This is not simply a diplomatic dispute, it's a strategic demonstration of leverage. Now consider another revealing development. According to satellite imagery analysis published by Maxar Technologies on March 10, 2026, several Iranian naval vessels associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy repositioned near the Strait of Hormuz, including at least 2 Paykap-class fast attack craft and a Shahid Soleimani-class missile corvette. Individually, these deployments may seem routine, but collectively they indicate something analysts recognize immediately: deterrence signaling. The objective is not necessarily immediate confrontation. The objective is to remind Washington and global markets that Iran retains the capacity to disrupt one of the world's most critical energy choke points if escalation continues. Meanwhile, Gulf states are watching carefully. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Energy quietly announced on March 11th that it was reviewing contingency plans to increase production output should regional supply disruptions occur. The kingdom currently maintains approximately 3 million barrels per day of spare production capacity, according to data from OPEC's February 2026 market report. And the United Arab Emirates has begun redirecting some shipments through the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, a route specifically designed to bypass the Strait of Hormuz during crisis scenarios. So what we're witnessing is not a single political outburst or diplomatic disagreement. It is a chain reaction. A ceasefire collapses, rhetoric escalates, proxy networks activate, energy markets respond, regional powers reposition, and the strategic consequences are only beginning to unfold. Now let me break down exactly what this means sector by sector, because the economic, military, and technological implications of this confrontation are far larger than the headlines currently suggest. Now let me break down exactly what this confrontation means sector by sector, because the ripple effects are extending far beyond diplomacy. 1. The economic dimension, energy markets and sanctions pressure. Start with energy, because that's where the first measurable shock is already appearing. Global oil markets remain extremely sensitive to instability in the Persian Gulf. As of March 2026, roughly 21 million barrels of oil per day move through the Strait of Hormuz, representing about 1/5 of global petroleum consumption, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Any perception that shipping routes could be disrupted immediately triggers volatility. That's precisely what we're seeing now. Within hours of Iran rejecting the ceasefire, Brent crude climbed nearly 4%, reaching the $89 to $90 per barrel range. Energy analysts at Goldman Sachs Commodities Research warned that a sustained escalation could push prices above $105 per barrel, particularly if insurance premiums for tankers operating in the Gulf begin rising. But the energy story cuts both ways. Iran itself relies heavily on oil exports. Despite sanctions, Iran is currently exporting between 1.5 and 1.7 million barrels per day, most of it shipped to China through intermediary trading networks in Malaysia and Singapore, according to tracking data compiled by Vortexa Analytics in February 2026. So Tehran's strategy involves a delicate calculation: maintain enough pressure to deter U.S. actions without triggering a disruption so severe that it undermines its own export revenue. That balance, pressure without collapse, is central to Iran's economic posture. 2. The strategic dimension, military posture and deterrence. The second dimension is military positioning. The United States maintains approximately 45,000 troops across the broader Middle East, according to the Pentagon's 2025 Force Posture Review. Key installations include Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Naval Support Activity Bahrain, home to the U.S. Fifth Fleet, and Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. These installations form the backbone of American deterrence in the region. In response to the current escalation, U.S. Central Command has reportedly increased aerial surveillance patrols and maritime monitoring in the Gulf. Defense analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, note that the United States is likely emphasizing integrated air and missile defense coordination with regional allies, but Iran's approach is fundamentally asymmetric. Rather than matching American military capabilities directly, Tehran relies on what strategists call distributed escalation capacity. That means dozens of smaller pressure points, militia networks, drone capabilities, missile stockpiles that can complicate any direct military response. For example, Hezbollah is believed to possess more than 150,000 rockets and missiles, according to estimates published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in its 2025 Military Balance Report. Even limited involvement from such forces dramatically alters the risk calculations for regional conflict. This isn't about parity, it's about deterrence through complexity. 3. The technological dimension: drones, missiles, and supply chains. The third dimension is technological, and it's transforming modern conflict. Over the past decade, Iran has invested heavily in unmanned aerial systems and precision-guided missile technology. The Shahed-136 loitering drone, for example, has become a central component of Iran's asymmetric warfare doctrine. These drones cost an estimated $20,000 to $50,000 per unit, dramatically cheaper than the missile defense systems designed to intercept them. That cost imbalance creates a strategic advantage. A defending state may spend millions of dollars on interceptor missiles, such as the Patriot PAC-3, while an attacking force deploys comparatively inexpensive drones in large numbers. Iran has also expanded defense cooperation with Russia. Since late 2024, intelligence assessments from Western security agencies, cited by the Financial Times, indicate ongoing exchanges involving drone technology and missile components. These partnerships amplify Iran's capacity to sustain long-term pressure. 4. The political dimension: domestic and international pressures. Finally, there is the political dimension, and it may be the most consequential. Inside Iran, economic hardship remains severe. Inflation is hovering around 38%, youth unemployment exceeds 22%, and the national currency has lost more than 60% of its value against the dollar since 2018. Yet paradoxically, external confrontation can strengthen hardline factions within the Iranian political system. Historically, moments of international pressure have allowed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to consolidate influence by framing resistance as national defense. Meanwhile, in Washington, the political environment is equally charged. Iran policy has long been one of the most polarized issues in American foreign policy debates. The contrast between diplomatic engagement, such as the 2015 nuclear agreement, and coercive pressure, such as the 2018 sanctions campaign, represents two fundamentally different strategic philosophies. And when public figures like Donald Trump enter the conversation with strong rhetoric, the policy debate immediately intensifies. So what we're seeing is not just geopolitical maneuvering abroad, it's also political signaling directed at domestic audiences. Now here's the key takeaway from all of this. This confrontation operates simultaneously across four arenas: energy markets, military deterrence, technological warfare, and political legitimacy. Each of those arenas amplifies the others, which means even small developments, one missile launch, one tanker incident, one diplomatic statement, can cascade into much larger consequences. If you're getting value from this breakdown, make sure you're subscribed. This channel provides the kind of detailed geopolitical analysis that helps you understand not just what's happening, but why it matters and where it's headed. But the story doesn't end there, because the ripple effects are now spreading beyond the immediate players, and the way other nations are responding may ultimately determine whether this crisis stabilizes or spirals further. But the story doesn't end with Washington and Tehran. In fact, the most revealing developments are now coming from countries that are not directly involved in the confrontation, but whose responses will shape how this crisis evolves. Let's begin with China, because Beijing has quietly become the most important external economic partner for Iran. Over the past 3 years, China has emerged as the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil, purchasing an estimated 90% of Iran's sanctioned exports, according to shipping data analyzed by Kapler and TankerTrackers.com throughout 2025. Much of this oil is routed through intermediary hubs in Malaysia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, allowing shipments to bypass formal sanctions enforcement. For Beijing, this arrangement serves two strategic purposes. First, it secures discounted energy supplies at a time when China's economy, still recovering from the property sector slowdown that began in 2023, requires stable import flows. Second, it deepens China's influence across the Persian Gulf as part of its broader Belt and Road Initiative energy corridor strategy. Now consider what happens if tensions escalate further. A disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would not only impact Western economies, it would also threaten Chinese energy security. That is why Chinese diplomats have already begun quietly urging restraint. According to statements released by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs on March 11, 2026, Beijing called for all parties to avoid actions that could destabilize regional shipping routes. That phrasing reflects a familiar Chinese diplomatic pattern, avoiding direct criticism while signaling concern over economic consequences. Meanwhile, Russia is approaching the situation from a different strategic angle. Since the start of the Ukraine war in February 2022, Moscow and Tehran have steadily expanded security cooperation. Western intelligence agencies have reported exchanges involving drone systems, missile technologies, and battlefield coordination frameworks. For Russia, prolonged instability in the Middle East offers two indirect advantages. First, higher oil prices increase revenue for Russia's energy sector, which continues to operate under Western sanctions. According to data from the International Energy Agency's February 2026 market outlook, every $10 increase in oil prices generates approximately $15 billion in additional annual export revenue for Russia. Second, geopolitical distraction in the Middle East diverts Western diplomatic and military attention away from the European theater. Now shift focus to the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Both countries are walking a strategic tightrope. On one hand, they remain key security partners of the United States. On the other, they have spent the past 2 years attempting to stabilize relations with Tehran. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran signed a Chinese-brokered normalization agreement in Beijing, reopening diplomatic channels after 7 years of hostility. That agreement reduced tensions across several proxy conflicts, particularly in Yemen. But a renewed U.S.-Iran confrontation places Gulf governments in a delicate position. They want stability in energy markets and security guarantees from Washington, but they also want to avoid becoming the battlefield for another regional escalation. This explains why Saudi officials have recently emphasized regional de-escalation frameworks during discussions at the Gulf Cooperation Council Summit held in Riyadh in December 2025. Finally, there's the European dimension. European governments remain deeply concerned about the possibility that escalating tensions could derail diplomatic efforts to limit Iran's nuclear program. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency's January 2026 report, Iran is now enriching uranium to 60% purity, significantly above the 3.67% limit established under the original JCPOA agreement. That level of enrichment shortens the so-called breakout time, the time required to produce weapons-grade material, if Iran ever decided to pursue that path. European diplomats therefore see the ceasefire collapse not just as a regional issue, but as a development that could undermine the entire framework of nuclear diplomacy. So what we're witnessing now is a widening geopolitical circle. The crisis began with a ceasefire rejection between Washington and Tehran, but its consequences are now pulling in China's energy strategy, Russia's geopolitical calculations, Gulf security dynamics, and Europe's nuclear diplomacy concerns. Which brings us to the bigger question: what does this moment actually signal about the future structure of global power politics? Because when multiple major actors reposition simultaneously, it often means something deeper is shifting beneath the surface. So where does this leave us? Step back from the headlines for a moment, and a much larger pattern begins to emerge. What appears on the surface to be a single diplomatic breakdown, a rejected ceasefire, a sharp political response, a spike in oil prices, is actually part of a broader structural shift in the way power is being exercised across the international system. Three things in particular stand out. First, deterrence in the Middle East is becoming increasingly decentralized. Instead of traditional state-to-state confrontation, influence is now projected through networks, militias, proxy groups, cyber capabilities, and low-cost drone technologies. Iran's distributed strategy, stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, reflects a model designed specifically to complicate conventional military responses. Second, economic leverage is now inseparable from geopolitical competition. Oil markets, shipping lanes, sanctions regimes, and energy supply chains are no longer just economic variables. They are instruments of strategic pressure. When Brent crude jumps $3 in an afternoon because of a diplomatic statement that tells you how tightly global markets are now tied to geopolitical risk. And third, major powers are increasingly interacting through overlapping crises. Russia's confrontation with the West in Ukraine, China's expanding economic footprint across the Gulf, America's long-running rivalry with Iran. These dynamics do not exist in isolation. They reinforce each other. Pressure in one region amplifies tensions in another. That is why moments like this, when a ceasefire collapses and rhetoric escalates, matter more than they appear to at first glance. History shows that geopolitical turning points often begin with decisions that seem tactical in the moment. The rejection of a negotiation, a military deployment that signals resolve, a political statement that reshapes expectations. The question now is whether this latest rupture leads to renewed diplomacy, or whether it becomes another step in a longer cycle of escalation that has been building for years. And one final point deserves attention. This story is still unfolding in real time. Diplomatic channels remain active. Energy markets are recalibrating by the hour. Military planners across multiple capitals are adjusting contingency scenarios, which means the next 24 to 48 hours could be particularly revealing. This story is far from over, and I'll be tracking every development. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next 48 hours could bring even more dramatic shifts. This is the kind of moment where understanding the full picture separates informed observers from those caught off guard, because when the strategic landscape begins to move this quickly, the consequences rarely stay confined to one region.